Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Lookout. Today's the 31st of August, and we're covering fires in northwestern California and western Oregon. And we're starting off with our kind of traditional introduction. My name is Zeke Lunder. I work in Chico, California as a wildfire analyst, and we provide wildfire briefings and education and entertainment using publicly available information. I've been doing this work for about 25 years. And a lot of what we show you is mapping that we've created kind of from ownership maps and just all kinds of data that I've been collecting really for the last 25 years, my whole career. So we try to do some storytelling here, help people understand what's going on with wildfire. Our aim is to improve the wildfire literacy of the population. So people are less kind of susceptible to conspiracy theories and the kind of politicization of fire management. We try to kind of present the science and just a fact-based approach. There will be some opinion in there from based on my career of spending the last 25 years running around the West Coast, working on major wildfires, thinking about this stuff a lot. It's been my professional world. So, but all that said, we're not, this is not official government fire information, which gives us some leeway to talk about things that the folks that are working as public information officers on the fires can't. But in no way are we intending to replace those folks. We don't ever want anyone to watch a broadcast here and then decide that they don't need to evacuate or that the evacuation warning they're getting is stupid or we're not on the ground. We don't have the information that the folks on the ground have. So we've got to add that disclaimer. We're not official fire information, and you should still listen to what folks on the ground have to say. So I want to start off, we're going to look at the weather from yesterday. We've been watching for several days as a forecast north wind event was going to impact fires that we had burning here in Northern California and Western Oregon. And we've been sharing some models that showed kind of dire predictions of potential spread, and that really didn't come to pass yesterday. To be fair, we ran the models out through tonight, so tomorrow we're going to revisit the model runs that we shared and compare them to actual reality, what actually happened. And that's one of the reasons we're sharing the models, is just to talk about kind of the limitations of technology in helping manage these really large-scale fires. But we'll jump in here, and I'll remember today to to share my screen when I need to, right? All right, so just to start off here, we got a 12-hour loop of West Coast, and it's showing basically this front coming in that's going to bring cooler temperatures and moisture. It's just starting to hit around Gasky right now. And we can see on here also the heat of the fires. And we'll do another loop here that shows the heat in more detail. Oftentimes when fires are blowing up, this satellite that we call GOES is it's way out there in outer space, but it's 1 kilometer resolution, so about 1,000 yards for each pixel here, which ends up being pretty amazing. So it's got different channels, and the channels show these channels show thermal heat. So here, starting yesterday morning, we can see the fires here really pick up in northwestern California. We've got the, let's see. Oh, sorry. Trying to run my mouse again here. We've got up in the upper part of the screen, we've got the Smith River complex. They don't make it easy here I want to get my little bright pointer so people can see what we're actually talking about. Give me a second. All right, now we're talking. Sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, anyway, we've got the heat satellites here, and you can see yesterday afternoon that we had big growth right on the California-Oregon border on the Smith River complex. Right up in here. See how just really the whole fire lit up for a couple hours. We also had pretty major growth down here in the Klamath on the Copper Fire in here. So we were watching this yesterday, trying to get an idea of where the fires were blowing up. And you can also on this image see the moisture start to stream in here at the end. Jump into kind of current conditions in northwestern California. Winds are pretty mild. We've got some winds here, down canyon winds at 9 miles an hour. Humidities are pretty high, as we've been seeing every morning. 70% humidity, 77, 97 here down by Orleans. Even over on the east side, humidity's in the 60s. We talk about humidity recovery, being what happens to the moisture overnight. And humidity recovery is really important for firefighting because humidity brings moisture that dampens fine fuels like grass and ferns and other light stuff that really is a carrier of fire. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, about when we talk about why these fires really didn't blow up too big yesterday. So as we've been seeing, we got places here like in Syed Valley, it's 46 degrees. Humidity's up around 70%. As we've said many mornings here, like if you went out in Syed Valley right now and you had, I'm not saying you should, but if you have, dry grass in your front yard and you went out right now and threw a match in it, it wouldn't burn. The match would go out. And so that's good news for firefighters. It's good news for fire behavior. A lot of the stuff that burned hot yesterday now is just kind of backing and smoldering. So on fires like this, if we have a night shift, they can make good hay during these conditions. One of the problems that we've got with the way we staff fires is that we're on either 12 or 24-hour shifts, and people rotate at 7 in the morning. You got a new shift comes on at 7, gets briefed, goes out. But by the time you get gas, get your lunch, do your briefing, do your breakout, do your safety meeting, everything else, a lot of times if you have to drive a ways to get to the fire, you might not get to the fire line until 10 a.m., right when the sun's starting to kind of get higher in the sky, humidity's starting to drop, and temperatures are going up. So we miss these great windows because the ships that are coming off the line, if they're going to get back to camp at 7, they might leave the fire line at 4 or 5, depending on the country and the assignment and everything else. So we miss some really good windows for firefighting just because of kind of administrative things like deciding we're going to do a shift change at 7 a.m. There's not really an ideal time to do a shift change, but there are some, talk to some of the old timers like Jim Clump, and they're like, well, how about if we, had staggered shifts where everyone works 15-hour shift and, you rotate so you have overlap. So there's some practical things like that and just administrative things that get in the way of us taking advantage of some of the best conditions. Like right now at 8 a.m., there's a lot of people who are not yet on the fire line because they're finishing a briefing, getting gas, doing a breakout, whatever. And right now, so they're missing this great opportunity to put fire out. So we're going to jump right into the maps, and then we're going to kind of overlay this discussion about all these different things we want to talk about onto kind of what we're seeing on the maps. So just to give you kind of a big picture view, we're starting off here down by High-on-Palm, which most people have never seen or been to or even heard of. But if you've worked in fire, you know where High-on-Palm is. Just to zoom out here, we're going to start off here down west of Redding. We're going to work our way up north, up northwestern California, and then up to Portland. But back here to High-on-Palm, this fire, the 3-9 fire, we've got this really wide variety of vegetation types that our fires are burning in this year. And this fire yesterday morning, this fire was active. This fire's been active for a couple of days. And it made a big run in the last... during the wind event yesterday, it had already kind of started this run. The white lines here are where the fires were yesterday morning or the night before last. And then the red fill is intense heat. So the fire kind of squirted out a big run, and now it's being driven by the slope up the hill. So as we have wind blowing on this fire, we've also got the effect of slope. And so we get kind of what's called quartering spread, where the fire it's not just running down cross slope. It's also it's wanting to burn up the hill as it goes too. So fire, there's always kind of a battle between the influence of slope and the influence of wind, and the direction of wind and the direction of slope. And a lot of when we talk about fire modeling, There's some calculations that look at kind of given the conditions, is the fire going to be more affected by running up the hill or by the wind? Kind of the big box strategy on this fire, they've got most of this fire. If you look at where the yellow and white line intersect, that's where the fire has not spread. So this fire is pretty much going cold along these yellow areas. There's some spots where it's kind of rolled out. And so for days, this fire, they were kind of trying to figure out how to get in and fight this flank, and then the wind blew it out. So the next kind of logical place is on this ridge here to the south, about 1.5 miles. This has been treated retardant. Retardant can be really effective in these places where we've got grass and scattered oaks because it can kind of penetrate the vegetation. If we come in here into a denser area of canopy and brush, oftentimes the retardant can't really get down to the surface. And if you don't have people there on the ground, the fire can just kind of come up and burn through the grass underneath the trees that have the retardant in them and keep going. Anyway, there's been a lot of pre-treating done. And as we've talked about in the big picture of aviation on these fires, we've had generally westerly winds in this country, and the canyons here pack in with smoke. And so oftentimes this has been like the fire that, because this fire doesn't have fires out to the west and it's not in the middle of the canyons, this has been one of the fires through this whole campaign that's been kind of most available for retardant drops. So early on in this complex, this fire got a lot of retardant drops. But we were short on resources, and retardant alone kind of checks fires up, but it doesn't put them out. So we're going to talk a bit as we go through today about, we hear a lot about how come we're not flying more helicopters? How come we're not flying VLATs? How come we're not putting these fires out? And the geography here really is one of the reasons. As we talked about yesterday, you've got valleys like High on Palm, Willow Creek, you've got Weaverville. These places that, hell base takes up a lot of space. Especially if you've got, 10 Type 1 helicopters, you need acres for each ship really to operate and to safely, have ships coming and going. And so there's no flat spots for heli bases really in this country that aren't going to get smoked in. So we got, great opportunities to put heli base in Hoopa or maybe in Willow Creek, maybe in High on Palm or Hayfork. But those are the places in the canyon bottoms that get smoked in the worst. And so you can have, and these Type 1 helicopters cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a week to operate. But you can have 10 ships just sitting there in the smoke, unable to fly. And then when we do get visibility for them to take off here, there might not be visibility at the fire itself because the fire might be 30 or 40 miles away. So it's really easy to tie up millions of dollars worth of aviation assets sitting in the smoke in the Klamath. And it happens every time we have a big campaign fire. And so you'll look at a fire and see that they've got a bunch of Type 1s assigned, but those helicopters might get a couple hours a day of visibility to actually operate. So coming up here to Hoopa, the fire here south of Hoopa is pretty much, it's been out, or not out, but it's been getting wrapped and not spreading beyond his box for over a week. So we're going to jump in right into the Six Rivers complex. We've been really following the fire here in Orleans. So the white line again is where the fire was night before last, and then orange and yellow are kind of, orange is intense heat, yellow is scattered heat. So I can see that the interior is calming down. And the red is active. So we've got what we've seen for days here on this fire. Fire is slowly backing down the hill. We're getting generally beneficial fire effects from this fire. This fire, if you're in Orleans and you look up the hill, you're looking right up Pearch Creek. And you see dead trees up here from a fire that happened 17 years ago, the Soames fire. So the big thing we've been watching here, and the big kind of concern we had was just they've put a ton of fire on the ground here over the last 4 days and been trying to add to it with UAVs. I'm not real well appraised on what's been going on there, but there was definitely concern that this is exposed to the north winds. We're looking from the north here, and I was definitely concerned that we might have rollout down here, leaning to kind of short crown run that could spot into this next drainage, and away we'd go. So good news there is just that didn't happen. Kind of the other news on this fire is just that it continues to back down into Butler Creek. And kind of from the get-go, folks were saying, yeah, they're not going to hold it on that ridge. It is going to kind of burn out to a footprint that we've seen in like the Soames fire in 2006. So not a lot of active backing. The models that we shared the other day originally showed a lot of potential for spread out to the west. And we're going to talk more about the modeling, but just the models really kind of don't work real well in super broken terrain where there's all kinds of micro topography, just all kinds of things that affect the flow of wind through this landscape. It's really hard to predict how winds move through this landscape and hence how fire is going to move. So things looking good on the Perch on this infrared. We'll bop over to Mosquito. So we're looking out to the coast here. And kind of for the big picture view, this is kind of a pretty remote part of California that most people will never see. But if you do want to see this country, and it's kind of like our own little Idaho in Northern California, sometime drive from Wairika to Willow Creek on Highway 96, and you'll see this amazing landscape where this all goes down. There's a lot of there's a lot of folks that live out here, and if you look at our previous videos, we've talked a lot about kind of the fire culture here. But just to clue you into where we're talking about, we're kind of between Willow Creek and Happy Camp, or between Wairika and Eureka. And the Klamath River comes out of Oregon and comes down through here and goes out to the ocean up here. So it makes this big hook. So kind of in the middle of that big hook of the Klamath, we've got the Mosquito fire and the Bluff fire. These fires early on didn't get a lot of resources. They were burning on tops of the mountains, and the big concern of these was just that they're burning in an area that hasn't had fire for 100 years for the most part. So we see that pretty much these fires held pretty well through the wind event. Some firing continued here on the north side. We see these little fingers. We know that's a firing operation. So we see that firing is they didn't put a lot of fire on the ground on either of these fires in the last 36 hours or so because of that wind event. So we see there was a little bit of spread kind of downslope on Bluff. The one thing that kind of we were kind of waiting to happen here is the fire did kind of cross this mid-slope road. We've been waiting for days to see if they're going to hold this mid-slope road, and we've talked a lot about why holding mid-slope roads is difficult. This spot here was well established like night before last, and during the wind event, it did spread more. So that just kind of expands the box of where they've got to deal with, maybe the next thing will be a firing operation out on this road. The thing about these firing operations off roads that backfire downhill is they tend to kind of maximize, when you have a firing operation where you're backing fire downhill, you kind of maximize the potential for good fire effects. And so a lot of these firing operations are basically being treated like a prescribed burn, where we start at the top of the hill, we bring the fire down. So no big growth to report on those. One of the more interesting things that happened yesterday on the big picture heat satellite was we were watching this heat here on the Copper Fire build. And what's counterintuitive sometimes is that you can have a north wind and still have the fire spread into the wind. So this is the Blue 2 and Marlow fires. We really didn't see much spread to the south on these, which in part because these south edges were kind of cooling off already. But I expected more growth to the south, and the models definitely predicted more growth to the south. So what we ended up seeing was a big portion of the heat we saw yesterday was out here on the Copper Fire, which started as a spot from Blue 2, I believe. And it made some slope-driven runs. So it's interesting there that it made a slope-driven run to the northwest when we had we had winds blowing this way. But the effect of the slope and the fuel loading in here was enough that the fire still made a good uphill run kind of on the lee side of this south-facing slope. There's a lot of fuel in here from the fires that burned in 2008. And I think this might have burned in 2015 as well. Coming over here to Elliot / Swillup fire. As we've seen for days and days, the fire still hasn't crossed Dillon Creek. It's pretty much cold. We're seeing no heat out to about halfway up Dillon Creek, and then scattered heat and kind of intense heat where the fire continues to flank out to the west. There's kind of a control box for these fires that follows this ridge where previous fires have been contained. This fire that's out to the west is kind of outside the control of that potential box, and so likely to continue, but just really right now just backing and flanking slowly. So from the white line to the new fire, you can see that there's been a firing along this box and down this road here. It's hard. This looks like this is not kind of really if they were trying to hold this in this box here, it's not. But I don't think that was really the strategy. Continued spread up this canyon. We've kind of been watching the afternoon slope influence push fire up. So this firing here along the ridge, in part, is a response to keep ahead of this fire that has potential to boil up out of there. So everything so far on Swillup in the control box looks pretty good. Like they've held the north end and they're engaged in building this firing, and this infrared is taken after the wind event. So they made it through the wind event there, and things are going well on building that box. Over here to U-Fish fire, really just incredible spread. You know, I think when we have time to make a progression map, you're going to see this really incredible slow, steady march of this fire, and you're going to see beneficial fire effects for a lot of this slow-moving backing fire. Like when we talk about using fire at the landscape scale, this is what we're talking about. It's like, hey, let's go out here and light a fire at the top of the hill and let it back downhill. And so the fact that this can happen in August, a lot of people would say, oh man, you're never going to use managed fire in August in the Klamath. As we've talked a lot about in this particular scenario, this fire started its life already contained largely by another large major wildfire, 2021. We'll turn that on in a minute. Anyway, got a firing operation here that's been underway to tie it down with dozer line and hand line. That has continued over the last 36 hours. There's firing going on out here to backfire off the ridge down to this road system, which is prepped. We're looking now at the Malone fire. All cooling off. Firing has been completed around this fire. It's cooling off here, and they lit interior firing yesterday to kind of clean it up, and that is cooling off as well. No fire over Elk Creek Road. So I'm going to open up a couple maps here. Okay, so just real quick to look at where we got here. This is U-Fish. We just looked at this. This doesn't have the updated infrared, but you can see got dozer line and hand line on the north end of U-Fish, and this is the firing operation we're just looking at. Here's the firing operation we're talking about, where we can see them bringing fire out to this prepped road. So there's road and hand line. And then here's Malone, and you can see the firing there, and that it's wrapped with dozer line and hand line. So of all the fires in the Klamath, the head fire got wrapped pretty quickly. It was a high priority, had a type 1 team on it right away. This fire, we're like 2 weeks into it, and their plan is going really well. As we talked about, a lot of this, kind of firing planning is like, well, how long is it going to take us to prep? What are the resources we have? How much can we get done with them? And how far out ahead of the fire do we need to be to get that done before the fire gets there? So these fires are a pretty good example just of kind of like the choreography that goes into executing containment of a large fire. This is Swillup, and we talked about the north end of Swillup being kind of cold. When you see the black line around the fire on the fire maps, that means that it's contained. Or generally, if you don't see red on there, they're saying, yeah, this is contained. We feel comfortable with that. So we've got mixed line around here between roads, and when we see this M mixed, it means that it's kind of, there's road that's been prepped, there's hand line that's been thrown in, there's dozer work in along that. But basically, you can see that box we've been talking about on Swillup on the north end. And here on the south end of Elliot, there's kind of a proposed, when you see pink lines, it means that it's proposed. And it's hard to tell here what they'll do because the fire's already established out kind of past their box here, what's going to happen there. One thing that's going to happen here is that all this stuff looks to get rain on it. And so, like we've said, rain is what puts out large fires. Just while we're still in ops map mode, here is the Pearch fire. Here's the firing that got done along the bottom. And the plan is to carry that firing down Handline and tie it back into Highway 96 above Pearch Creek community. They halted that because they wanted time to let the wind event pass. As we said, one of the things that's tricky with firing operations is if we get some rain, they're not going to be able to fire this. And so that's difficult because then we're still going to have a whole bunch of active fire out here. And then if we get a week of drying and the fire becomes active again, we won't have had time to burn in a fire line there. So it really is this kind of funky choreography and dancing around the weather. So as far as the Happy Camp complex goes, we're not really seeing any heat over here on the head fire. Head has really not done much for over a week. The Scott and Gold fire have backed down the road and are cooling off. We've got the Hancock fire out here on Willie Creek, and that's it's showing scattered heat, but no really minor new growth. This red outside of yesterday's perimeter is kind of minor growth where it's now backing down into the next drainage. We're not really, we haven't been paying very close attention to these smaller fires in the Siskiyou Wilderness. They also didn't get a lot of resources. They also didn't see they haven't seen much spread. So now we're going to move into the river complex. Here on the hurdy-gurdy fire, there was some spread yesterday, but like these other fires, hurdy-gurdy started up on top of the mountain and it has to back downhill to go anywhere. So yesterday on the webcams, we saw some heat billowing up on the south side of the Kelly fire here, which is kind of, the fires have merged on the Smith River complex, but this started its life as Kelly. Down here we've got Coon. And basically Coon is now touching Kelly. The strategy here has been to fire down the 405 road and then bring fire across here below Coon, as far as I can tell. So yesterday with the blow up, we did get there some new heat out here, spotted off the 405. It also crossed the 405 closer to the top of the ridge. And so the primary control box here kind of just got pushed out. The fire is now established in here, very likely is going to back down in here, and it might be that the next control is, the next ridge. That said, it's going to get rain, and maybe that knocks it down enough that we can get firefighters in there, go direct, and this will be where the fire ends up. Rain is just one of those things that when it happens, sometimes you get to do things that you weren't going to do. You weren't going to put people down a super steep slope below a fire that was actively, burning and spotting and torching and had potential. But if this gets rained on just smoldering, then maybe you drop crews down in there and you're able to put it out. Continued downhill spread on Kelly. There's some heat out here across this next drainage, and it's hard for us to tell really if that is a spot from yesterday or if it's strategic firing or what. I'm not appraised on that. Coming up here to Gasky, good news is that we were worried yesterday about this heat up here spreading down with the north winds and pushing down towards Gasky, and it did spread downhill, but a quarter mile or less. And so we continue to have this kind of backing fire. And so what we see is just that the north wind really didn't surface down in these canyons to any sort of effect that had a major effect on fire behavior. Headed up 199, we talked about how they've been using UAVs to drop fire down these ridges and attempt to kind of slowly backfire down here. So this is no longer a threat to the power line or people down in here. and that continues to back. So you see the intense fires, that's the continued backing fire from these firing operations that happened maybe 3 nights ago. So continued growth. So it's going to be another one of those fire maps that's really interesting to look at the progression. So as far as what was really torching up yesterday, like when we look at the come back and look at the heat satellite from yesterday. We saw a lot of action here on the state line, basically. Sorry, it's not moving faster, but that's what it is. Right there. And then we saw heat here south of 199. This is what we talked about with the copper fire blowing up, and then this is Malone. Or not Malone, Swillup. So that heat, now we're going to talk about what was the big growth yesterday on this fire. Basically, if you look at the white line up here of where the fire was the night before last, all that fire blew south. And so this whole area burned in the last 24 hours, likely with pretty high severity. So out in here still hasn't burned. So the fire pushed out a little to the north, but the areas here were looking north that were hot the night before last, they really moved. This firing operation here that they got done up the dozer line took out a big chunk with that north wind. And as we've talked about, oftentimes you have to use the windows you've got. If you got a north wind, it might be the time that you have the best odds of firing a line on the north end of the fire. Oftentimes that means you get higher fire severity than you want. Like this got fired yesterday, and it's not ideal to go and light head fire off the road with in the middle of a north wind. As far as just the ecological effects, I guess on the upside is like this is all an old burn that was pretty scrubby already, so it's not like this nuked off a bunch of old growth or anything. But that's kind of a gift to the firefight, is that that's helping build this box. Likely this firing has continued down this ridge since this infrared was shot last night. But that's really good news for O'Brien, is just that this dozer line that got fired, the winds were really favorable, and now you've got this nice big deep black. And this fire out here is not going to push out and threaten O'Brien. So when we look at the rest of this flank kind of out to 199, for the most part, we see this yellow on the white line. That hasn't grown in 24 hours. This little bit out here looks to be potentially a firing operation, just the way it follows the ridge. So that's good news. If you're an O'Brien, I think it's good news to see that north line held and they were able to deepen that black. All right. Water break. So George says, one day I wonder if they'll just leave Klamath lightning busts to be apart from structure and point protection. Seems like that hit the balance of fire restoration and resource use better. That's what the locals are talking about for sure. Let me just we're going to bring up the layers. We talk a lot about the same thing over and over, and I know we have new viewers sometimes who haven't heard kind of the big picture story we like to tell here in the Klamath. So here's a quick little detour into kind of Klamath fire history. We're looking at kind of the area between Pacific Ocean and Wairika, Scott Valley. So this is the Marble Mountain Wilderness and kind of the heart of the backcountry of the Klamath Mountains. What we've got here is fire history. So blue is kind of within the last decade. Green is within maybe the last 20 years. Progressively through the rainbow as you get up to red. Red being like 100 years, 1920s. And what we see here is you got a lot of overlapping fires that have happened out here in, say, the Forks of Salmon, Soames Bar. In the Salmon River, there's been a lot of fires that have burned in the same place 3 or 4 times. You've got what we talked about here with the Hancock Fire being surrounded by the McCash Fire, and then having some land out here that hasn't had fire for 100 years, but then quickly getting into land out here that burned in 2017. And so what we've talked about a lot here is that we've had mega fires in my career in the Klamath. We've had the Happy Camp complex that burned over 100,000 acres. These folks have suffered some real kind of devastating losses, but as a payback for that, now as these fires continue to fill in these big areas that haven't burned for a long time, we no longer have that potential. So if we have a fire out here in this area here, it might burn out to 3 other recent fire scars and be done. So a lot of fires like the Hancock start their life already contained. And so if there's anywhere in California where we would just let lightning fires burn, it's probably the Klamath is kind of, over the past 20 years, created the conditions that make that possible. This area here that Swillup is burning in hasn't burned in recorded history. But now we've got, when Swillup's done, then we've got, once that's done, we'll have a little island here that between these fires where you could let a fire burn and it's not going to do anything for the next 5 years. So that requires kind of a push from the public to see, to say they want it. Because right now, the Klamath National Forest, if there's a lightning fire, they're going to get on their Facebook and say, we put out all these lightning fires. And then a lot of people are going to say, that's great, we love you. And we need more people to say, why? Why did you put out that lightning fire? It was surrounded by 4 different fires. It wasn't going anywhere. So part of that is that literacy, that place-based literacy. And this is a unique place, the Klamath. Here's a statewide view of fire history. And the places I worry about aren't the places where we've had a lot of fire history. They're the places we have not. So you can see the Dixie Fire here in blue, along with the Bear Fire, where we've got, over 1 million acres that have burned in the last 3 years. We're just not that worried about fires threatening Greenville or Chester right now because all the fuel's gone. And I think that gives us opportunities to use fire in places where it's not going to go anywhere. Maybe there's a 5,000 acre box that's surrounded by recent burn where you can put fire on the ground. Right now up at Bucks Lake, we could go out here and we could put fire on the ground. And we'd only really have to worry about this flank of it because the rest is going to burn into areas that have burned in the last 3 years. So if we get a lightning strike, right here by Bucks Forebay or something, why would we want to put it out if we're getting good beneficial fire effects? If we can come in here and do an indirect line and burn that out and let this fire treat 1,000 acres, that is land that we weren't going to get done probably any other way due to kind of all the bureaucracy and everything that goes into it. So when I was saying that I worry about the areas that haven't burned for a long time, you look at these huge chunks, like everything between Highway 80 and the Bear Fire. We've got hundreds of thousands of acres here with no recent fire history. And those are going to get their fire. We see when we have a drought, we get a Bear Fire, we get a Dixie Fire. When we got deep drought and we get a fire going here in the Yuba River watershed, at some point we're going to have a Dixie Fire here that burns this entire chunk out. And the only thing that stops these large fires is when they hit other recent fires. So as we look down the Sierra, we're starting to kind of fill in those gaps where we've got the King Fire from 2014 created a big disruption. So when the Mosquito Fire burned last year in Forest Hill, it pretty much really died down when it hit the King Fire. We've got the Caldor Fire here that is starting that, and while all these fires are catastrophic, devastating, what they are doing is they are fragmenting the landscape. We've got the Butte Fire down here. We get down to the Southern Sierra and it's starting to look more like the Klamath, where we've got the overlap of the Rim Fire. We've got the Creek Fire. We're starting to really fill in the gaps. You also have granite that's not going to burn. But what still worries me is the places where you have big chunks that haven't burned yet, because we know they're going to burn. Give us a drought, extended drought, and starts on the wrong day in the wrong place, and we're just going to keep kind of covering the landscape with these Caldors, with these Rim Fires, with these King Fires. And while that's kind of hard to swallow, it is going to create the conditions that make it easier for us if we have the will to expand using fire, doing larger prescribed burns. So, for example, my brother has property on North Valley Road in Indian Valley. This entire slope burned with mixed severity during the Dixie Fire. And the Forest Service went in here a few weeks ago and put out a single tree that was on fire. But I look at this and see that we have an opportunity here to put fire in the ground and really have a very low risk of it spreading to the larger landscape. Private timberland owners are deathly afraid of using prescribed fire and then having a fire get away and getting giant fines. And there's precedent for that happening. But if I'm a private timberland owner here that has this chunk of land that didn't burn in the Dixie Fire, I've got an opportunity right now, maybe a 5-year window, to come in here and actually use fire, do some larger prescribed burns, and have zero risk of it spreading to the adjacent national forest. So I think that when we look at this larger landscape mosaic, we have to think about the opportunities that these new fires present and the fact that they're ephemeral, that they're fleeting. Within a few years, once you have a bunch of dead and down in this adjacent burn, we won't have this opportunity. So we have to get good at using that. Maybe even in the same year that it burns. We still got dozer line out here. Sometimes we even still have a hose lay. And it's just like, well, let's just use the other side of the dozer line and do a prescribed burn. Anyway, that's kind of your fire history tour of Northern California. I don't have quite as detailed fire history queued up for Oregon, but it's the same story. We call this the mosaic or the puzzle pieces. So I'm going to queue up our Oregon show here. But George, thanks for that comment. I think it's important that, the limitations that the Forest Service has in their ability to work at scale are real. Like, we're just not getting there. And I saw there's a new website that is going to allow us to track all the fuels projects that are getting done in California. And I thought, well, that's great because we can see then even though we're doing a lot of work and we're treating lots of projects, it's still a pittance when we talk about having 30 million acres of forest that need treatment. And if we treat, and there's this goal to treat 1 million acres a year. But right now, the scale's just not there. And wildfire is what's doing the heavy lifting of managing our forests. So don't worry, I won't start my map show without you, but I do have to queue up a couple layers here. There we go. All right. Okay. Cue the map. Barack Obama says 100 years of mismanagement. Yep. Yeah, 100 years of thinking we knew that what we were doing, right? 100 years of thinking we were doing the right thing. 100 years of some people knowing better. It goes back longer than that, right? I mean, people came out here, Europeans came out here and they thought that the native people were savages and they murdered them all. And they never thought to ask them about how they were managing the land. Or they never, took a minute to realize that the native people are, that humans are humans, and that the native people had their own advanced scientific knowledge based on thousands of years of practical experimentation of how to manage land. So many original sins. Rose Wolf says, who's allowed to use prescribed fire? Are there private companies that do it? Yes. I work for one. And most people are allowed to do some sort of burning on their own land. It's good to get some advice and some help. But in California, there's burning season, and there's a lot going on with that. If you want to shoot me an email, we can talk about. We'll have other episodes. Check out, we got a video on our YouTube, Citizen Burning in Butte County, landowner burning in Butte County, and that talks about some of this stuff. Okay. So now we're at the Rattlesnake Ridge. We're at the Tyee Ridge Complex. So just to kind of jump out here, got Roseburg down at the bottom here. Actually, Roseburg's right here. Sutherland, and these fires are burning out to the west near the town of Umpqua on the Umpqua River. This fire has kind of exceeded my expectations. I thought that maybe it would get wrapped quicker, but the winds haven't helped, and it isn't a real simple piece of topography. So what I want to talk about here is the winds yesterday compromised the main south line. So let me bring up the map here. Okay, Tyee Complex. Tyee is the main fire. So there's a dozer line that kind of comes out this ridge on the south end of the fire. And yesterday's wind blew the fire over the dozer line and down into this next creek. The plan here is kind of to continue out. There's hand line out this ridge. There's dozer line. Over on this side of the road, there's kind of dozer line on some of the ridges and hand line around most of this kind of slop. Not slop, but separate fire. So you can see this was the ridge that the dozer line was on. The fire has slopped over that and down into the next drainage. As we said, with this rain and everything, there's a good chance that this will get rained on. They'll be able to jump in there and go direct. They might have already done that overnight. But you can see that generally fire lines follow major ridges where we have access. So this fire continues to spread actively to the north. This is all BLM land out here. And something was wrong with the mapping where we don't have the perimeter of where the fire was the night before last. So these areas in the center pretty much have burned and the fire's out or not showing a lot of heat. Yellow is scattered heat. Orange is kind of where it's still actively happening. On this flank here, looks like it's kind of fired along this ridge road. Anyway, like I said, as far as stubborn, they got a lot of resources. The weather should help. Out here across the road, we've kind of had active spread in to the south on this fire. I'm not sure if that's the Tyee fire, what this one's called. And then out to the north, Big Tom or Tom something. This fire spread yesterday out to the north. It's kind of hemmed in now between these roads on the north and south. So I want to talk a little about checkerboard land ownership. We've got kind of a phenomenon all over the West Coast, but especially in Central Oregon. I was turning on the ownership layer here, where it's a legacy of the railroads. And so when they built the railroads up through the center of Oregon, they did what they call a checkerboard, where they gave every other section, every other square mile of public land to the railroads. So kind of following this I-5 corridor. In some places, kind of depended on how there was a lot of corruption going on back in the railroad days. And the railroads were expensive to build, and they'd go over budget, and they'd go bankrupt. And so there were all these different acts to kind of award lands to the railroads to incentivize them to keep building. And so in some places that goes out, up to like 30 miles from the main corridor where the railroad went through. But what we've got then is this resulting land mass has been consolidated over the last 150 years into pretty massive ownership. So like a lot of this land here is owned by Weyerhaeuser. Weyerhaeuser was from Minnesota, and a lot of the big timber companies on the West Coast got established in Minnesota and Michigan and Wisconsin, and they cut all the trees down by the late kind of 1800s, and so they needed new places to go to get more trees. And so once the railroad was built out to the West Coast, one interesting story is that James J. Hill, the original land baron, the original builder of the Great Northern Railroad, his neighbor on Summit Drive in Minneapolis, St. Paul, was Frederick Weyerhaeuser, and they were buddies. And so Hill sold Weyerhaeuser something like 1 million acres, 900,000 acres of the timberland that he had gotten by building his railroad for $5 million, because Hill wanted his trains to come back from the West Coast not empty, because they were running trains to export stuff to China even in the late 1800s. So the legacy of all of this is that we've got this checkerboard that's every other section is managed by private company versus BLM, and you've got kind of contrasting management objectives. BLM has done a lot of clear cutting, but they also have a mandate to manage for more habitat, and I'm not an expert on Oregon forest policy, but you can see just from the checkerboard that the private lands are in different condition in a lot of places than the BLM lands. But it makes management of the BLM lands kind of impossible if you want to like do a prescribed burn on BLM land and you're surrounded by private. We don't like to put a fire line kind of diagonally across the slope. We like to put a fire line at the top of the slope. So checkerboard land ownership creates some massive problems for landscape scale land management. If you've got owners that have wildly different objectives of how they want to manage their land. So as far as burning and checkerboard, and in some places the checkerboard has been consolidated into bigger chunks. So this is all BLM on the north. This is Weyerhaeuser and Roseburg land down on the south. But one thing we see in Western Oregon, and one thing I want to talk about today, is just that logging is oftentimes we get in these political silos, and we say, oh, these fires are all happening because the Forest Service isn't managing land. Or if we're still logging like we were in the 1960s when we didn't have these big fires, we wouldn't have these big fires. And that's kind of been proven to be false. That's proven to be kind of a myth, I would say, is we have to be really specific when we start tying kind of our personal politics and our land management politics and our take on government and everything to things we're saying about how land gets managed and how fire gets managed. Because as you can see, if logging deprives the land of fuel and fire's not going to burn, how come we lost this dozer line right at the top of the only clear cut in that whole area? Right? Obviously, fire was able to spread through that clear cut. Not to say that logging doesn't have a place. Logging has a place in altering the forest structure and oftentimes making it more resilient, both to bugs, insects, mortality, and fire. But you have to do it right. So if you do a clear cut and leave a bunch of slash out there, you've removed all the shade, and now you've got a bunch of grass and ferns and light fuels that can carry fire quickly. And that's not saying, I'm not saying anything about whether or not I think even age management is appropriate in West Side Douglas fir forests. Just saying that the facts are that when you remove shade, you have drier fuels. And so when we talk about using logging to alter landscapes' flammability, we have to be really specific and say, like, well, maybe we need to leave a certain amount of shade. Maybe we need to do a certain level of cleanup of the slash. Maybe we need to do a certain level of control of the brush afterwards. But forestry and silviculture, they're super complicated. Not a lot of people like to get together, like I do with my buddies. We get together and talk forestry, right? But a lot of people aren't going to like talk about thinning prescriptions when it comes to fire hazard reduction and what's the best mix there. So we got to be really careful when we say, oh man, if we just let the loggers back in there and logged everything like we did in the 1960s, we wouldn't have these big fires. It's like, no, it's not. Let's talk specifics about forestry, but let's not just throw out blanket statements that say logging's good, logging's bad, logging makes fires worse, logging makes fires better. It's complicated. Forestry's complicated. educate yourself. If you're going to go spout on Facebook that all this didn't happen when we used to have loggers in the woods, it's like, well, let's have a conversation about what constitutes good, effective forest management. Anyway, hoping that the weather kind of brings in some changes here and that they'll get a wrap on this one. We're going to fly out here to look at the Corral Fire, if we can find it. It's not a very big fire, kind of hard to find. Right, yeah, we got Glide here. We like to throw on these blue areas just to show the big fires we had in 2020. We've talked a lot about this and how these fires were started with east winds, so they got started and these strong east winds blew them out. And I think this is just a great kind of graphic example of that. These fires didn't stop when they got to heavily logged land. So people say, if we had more active forest management, we wouldn't have these fires. Well, it doesn't get much more active than tree farming on the west side of the Cascades. And the fires kind of marched right through these logged landscapes. So we got to be a little more nuanced than that when we throw that out there. These fires were kind of equal opportunity destroyers. They burned old growth, they burned second growth that was not recently logged. They burned a lot of land that had recently been logged. So this fire here above Glide, the Corral Fire, had active spread to the south yesterday. There's been firing operations that are cooling off on the top of it. It did spread a little to the north as well. But this fire is really, well established. And in this steep country, weather's going to be the thing that really knocks it down. But we don't expect that we're going to see direct attack in here and that somehow this fire is just going to get wrapped unless it gets, a couple inches of rain. Even then, this just kind of steep, wild country. As we talked about it in previous days, like there's a reason that these fires are all about the same size. Is that you have a fire that gets started, and see, this fire started middle of August, right? About the same time as our current fires got started. It got to this size because it got rained on at some point. So same with these, like fire history tells you a lot about what a subsequent fire is going to do. This fire got started when databases. We'll jump on the way back. We'll jump into something else about kind of what fire history tells you. But anyway, this fire likely going to keep growing. Its cousin up here, the Ridge Fire, is spreading into the wilderness. Not a lot of spread there. It's up high. Back here too, I keep not remembering what this fire here is. It's not really on our radar. Let me turn on my layers here. Got it. So here we got the Brice Creek fire. This is kind of south of Oak Ridge, about 10 miles. And this fire has been active. You can see that there's been some firing done here to try to keep it below this mid-slope road, and that squirted out. More firing over here. This is probably still on the right side of the road. But things like this happen. We talked a lot about why mid-slope roads are difficult. And, you might lose it here and have some heat here, and then the next afternoon get an up canyon wind on a south-facing slope. Oftentimes we can recover from a small slop like that. We've got access to the road. We can get water tender and some hose lays and catch it. It really just depends on how far it gets before you're on top of it. So here's Oak Ridge. We've got the Bedrock Fire here that's been burning for a month and a half or so. That's pretty much out. You can see on Bedrock that, never mind. Not a lot going on there. Over here to the Lookout Fire, my favorite fire. The The Horse Creek fire here hasn't spread much in the last 24 hours. There's a little bit down in kind of the riparian area in the bottom on the south end and a little out to the east. But other than that, no new spread. Here on the Lookout Fire, no new spread along the south flank. Looks like they fired to bring it out to the river. We've kind of been watching it fill in, and this is all kind of new. So it's hard to know if this was, how much of this was firing and how much of this was the wind. But it stayed pretty much on the correct side of the river. The infrared does show a slop on the east side of Highway 126, and we don't really have any info on what's going on there. And then the north end of Lookout, still active, not a lot of movement, and some firing going on out here. All right. So last one we're going to cover here is Camp Creek. As we talked about for a couple days, this is in the Portland Watershed. Provides all the water for Portland metro area. This fire did grow yesterday. It's hard to tell when it grew exactly because this white perimeter was a couple days old. They weren't able to fly it for a couple days because of weather. But what we see here is they've brought some fire out to this 14 road. And also there's fire. They brought fire out to the 12 road here. I guess this is the 12 on the maps. Thought it was the 14. But the box continues to kind of to bring it out to this road. Scattered heat, not a lot of spread on this fire. And from what we hear, potentially they're going to go direct out in here between these roads. It hasn't been spreading much. There may be opportunity to go in here and actually put a hand line in along the edge of the fire and pick it up direct. Some spread up the canyon here, and it's we don't really know what's going on there. Saw an editorial this morning in the Healthy Forests, Healthy Communities blog about forest management in the Portland watershed. It's been known for a long time that there's potential for a really devastating fire here, in part because the west side of the Cascades tends to have a long fire regime. It's not, when we say fire regime, that talks about how often you have fires and how intense they are. And the fire regime of the west side generally is that the forests are pretty wet, they're verdant, they grow a ton of biomass. And then every once in a while you've got a deep drought and a wind event and you get big fires that are destructive like these ones we see in blue, the 2020 lightning complex, or not, the 2020 Labor Day fires. And so if that happens here in Camp Creek, we're going to have a disaster because all that runoff from the burnt forests, all the erosion and everything is going to silt up these reservoirs and cause water quality problems for the million people that rely on this watershed. So it's been known for a long time that that's an issue. The watershed has been logged in the past, and this editorial I saw was kind of bemoaning the fact that Portland residents, there was an initiative that got passed that makes it harder to do active forest management in this watershed. So I think a question I have about that conflict or about that issue is just what is the solution here to, what would the prescription be? How specifically are we going to use forestry to improve the resilience of this particular watershed? Especially when we see that the fire regime that we have here is infrequent, strong, really intense fires that burn under windy conditions when we can't really suppress them. And so I think with all of this talk about using forestry to affect changes in in fire hazard, we have to talk about what's the scenario it's going to burn under, and is it possible for us to apply forest management in this watershed at the scale needed to hold up during the worst case scenario, the worst conditions, which is when we're going to have a large fire here. So I think we need to be realistic about the limits of our control, and we need to think about, maybe forest management can definitely play a role in helping protect this watershed. But we need to talk about, what does that look like? Does that mean that we do a 10,000 acre prescribed fire? Does that mean that we thin 80% of the landscape? It's it's complicated, right? It's trying to figure out how to do this work, what you're trying to mitigate. It's very complicated, and so it's easy to kind of use anytime there's a fire as an escape, as a launching point into your particular point of view about what you think needs to be done on the big picture. We need to have more active forest management across the country, but we really need to talk about specifics too. When we talk about, anytime we talk about using forestry and logging as a tool, we need to talk really specifically about what the fire might be that we're trying to mitigate, what it would take to change that, what's the science of that, and how much are we willing to do? Like, what are the odds of success? Because what we saw in the Dixie Fire, where I'm from, is that there had been an enormous amount of thinning done over the last 30 years to create more resilient, healthy forest conditions. And the Dixie Fire just erased like 100,000 acres of private timberland in 2 days. And so a lot of our assumptions about how forestry changes the dynamics of wildfires have kind of gone out the window, at least in our dry forests. So we're at this point where the scientists don't really know what's going on. The policy, the politics are all in conflict. But it's a good time to kind of have a reckoning of like, okay, in the face of climate change and changing fire behavior, what assumptions from the past do we have that are still worthy that we should put our energy into? And what are the ones that we really need to reconsider? Okay, well, what else did I say I was going to talk about? I think that's a lot. Trying to keep these to about an hour. I realize that I'm kind of like giving you a college lecture on fire told through the lens of active fires. And so I'm enjoying it. Enjoy your comments. I'll look at a few more comments over here. Someone says there's a difference between thinning and clear cutting. Yes, there is. George is saying, or Go Coyote wants to spend more money on preventative burning. I agree. Firefighting is really expensive. Okay, thanks everyone. Ryan Cowper Stevens had some comments about where you can find some of the data we use. It's good if you're a techie. If you're not, check out the Lookout, thelookout.org. While you're there, you can buy a hat, get some cool stickers, T-shirts, coffee mugs. My wife's making some really cool custom Lookout mugs. Those are going to be up there soon. And all right, Ryan says he's reminding me that we have a document of questions, and so I appreciate his help. Let's go find it here. YouTube questions. Who's allowed to use prescribed fire? Any specific suggestions on how to influence policy as a taxpayer? Well, I think just even starting with Facebook and asking questions. When you see that the Forest Service is bragging about putting out every lightning fire, talk to some folks. Maybe make a comment, ask a question. Why are you putting this out? Are there other fires in the area? What's the potential of this fire? I think just asking questions, and I think questioning the narrative that all fires are bad and must be suppressed immediately, and that all firefighting is heroic. Language is important, but just the media tends to feed this real line of firefighters are heroic, homeowners are victims, fire is the enemy. And then you put those three together and you find a story that talks about the heroic firefighters saving the homeowner from the terrible fire. And oftentimes the home maybe was built in a terrible place. Oftentimes the fire was actually achieving beneficial effects. And so I think asking for an alternate narrative, asking for more nuanced stories, if you know journalists, connecting them with, there's Association for Fire Ecology, there's Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology. And they have a media guide that is for reporters to help them ask better questions, more nuanced questions, and break free of kind of these really set narratives we have. But changing the conversation, I think, is just becoming informed, and then teaching other people. But that we need to spread this whole idea of wildfire literacy, I think, is important. In that an educated public, we need an educated public to push the Congress people, because they're responding to, people like simple messaging. And fire's not simple. Nothing about fire is simple, and nothing's simple about resource management. And so, education, literacy. Barack Obama's top comment was 100 years of mismanagement. And I think part of this is being humble and not thinking that necessarily we have the answer. We've thought we've had the answer over and over the last century. We thought we were doing the right thing. The people that put out all the fires in the 60s, a lot of them thought they were doing the right thing. And so us being humble and not thinking that it's simple, and also us understanding that we don't have control at the scale of the problem, that there's nothing we're going to do to prevent the U-boat watershed from burning in the next 20, 30 years. And that we have to kind of prepare for that. I've got an essay up on the Lookout that's about the limits of scale, it's called Ground Truth, the limits of thinking at scale. And that kind of spells out some of my thoughts on our limits of our ability to actually change the outcomes of these massive fires. Lots of rain forecast for today and tomorrow across western and central Oregon. Good comments in here. Appreciate you all. Got to run. Thanks a lot.